Okay, so we've got some really interesting stuff to dig into here. You've given me some sources that kind of point to a world that's, well, changing pretty drastically and quickly. Feels like we're at some kind of, I don't know, geopolitical crossroads. Like there could be breakthroughs with these long-running conflicts, and we're seeing countries rethinking their old alliances. And yeah, there's definitely a whole new power dynamic emerging, I guess you could say. What stands out to you most from what you've read?
I think what's really grabbing my attention is this potential change in how the US is, well, how they're approaching foreign policy. It's like everything's shifting under our feet, and this new administration is signaling that they want to try to ease up on these international tensions we've been seeing, especially with Russia and China. And it's interesting, right? Because they really seem to be putting their focus on domestic issues more than getting tangled up internationally.
So what does that kind of shift mean for, well, the rest of the world, especially those countries in Europe who have been close allies of the U.S. for like forever?
Well, I think this change in the US stance is definitely making waves, across Europe. A lot of nations have depended on the US for security for decades, and now this shift is making them rethink their whole strategies, right? So we might start to see European nations making more of their own foreign policies, independent of the US, and that could really like totally reshape the geopolitical landscape.
It's wild to see how changes within one country can have such a huge impact everywhere else. So let's talk about Ukraine. It's been all over the news. What changes are happening there, and what did you find in your sources?
One of the biggest developments is that the US is starting these direct talks with Russia, trying to find some kind of resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. What's kind of weird, though, is that Europe seems to be like left out of these discussions. It's definitely a big change from that hard line we were seeing before, and it could mean a major shift in how the conflict plays out.
It sounds like the U.S. is being more practical, like trying to find something that works, even if it means you got to make some concessions.
Yeah, and when you look at the terms they're discussing, it's pretty telling, right? It seems like Ukraine might have to make some major concessions, things like dropping their bid to join NATO and maybe even accepting that they've lost some territory.
Wow, those are big concessions. Is there any pushback, like within Ukraine or from other countries?
Oh, there are definitely some European politicians who are worried. They're concerned that the US is making deals without really thinking about their point of view or what it'll mean for Europe's security in the long run. It's tricky, right? A real balancing act.
Absolutely. So aside from these direct talks, are there any other signs that the U.S. is changing how they deal with Russia?
Well, yeah, another really noticeable change is how the US administration is talking about Russia publicly. They're not really pushing that whole, Russia is the biggest threat to Europe narrative anymore. Instead, they're pointing out all these internal challenges within Europe itself. So the focus is shifting. It's less about military confrontation now and more about economic competition, I guess.
So the U.S. is reevaluating their priorities, like their role in the world and how they see Russia.
Exactly. It's like they're moving all the pieces around on the geopolitical chessboard, right? They're signaling that they're pivoting strategically towards the Pacific, which basically means less attention on conflicts in Europe and the Middle East and more focus on how important the Pacific region is to American interests and security.
But won't that create a vacuum? I mean, if the U.S. is less involved in Europe and the Middle East, won't other countries try to fill that space?
Oh, absolutely. And we're already seeing some potential power grabs. For example, there's Turkey's ambitions in Syria, which are causing some concern. They're talking about setting up military bases there and training Syrian forces, which could easily escalate tensions with Russia and other players in the region.
So how's the U.S. reacting to all this in the Middle East? Are they stepping in to, manage things, or are they taking a different approach?
It seems like they're really trying to step back from those Middle Eastern conflicts. They're encouraging Arab nations to take the lead and find solutions on their own, like with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, for instance.
That's a big change. Are there any specific examples of how that's working out?
Well, there's a lot of talk about a new approach to the Gaza situation, which might completely sideline those old U.S. plans and open the door for Arab-led solutions. And with Iran, the U.S. is saying they're willing to renegotiate the nuclear deal, which could lead to sanctions being lifted and, maybe even a thaw in relations.
So the U.S. is pulling back from the Middle East, but are there other countries stepping up their influence globally?
Well, Russia's definitely making moves. They just agreed to set up a naval base in Sudan. It just shows how much their military reach is growing and, how ambitious they are globally. It's like as one power steps back, others are ready to jump right in.
Right, it's this complex dance of global power with each move causing ripples everywhere. So let's switch gears for a second and talk about these reports of the U.S. and Ukraine negotiating access to rare earth elements. Is this a big deal, or is there something else going on?
It might seem like a game changer, judging by the headlines, but the truth is it's a bit more complicated. People are questioning if these resources in Ukraine are even economically viable or if they're even accessible, really. Some experts think this whole negotiation is more about the U.S. trying to get back some of the money they invested in Ukraine rather than a strategic move to, dominate the rare earth market.
So it's more of a side deal, a way for the U.S. to get something tangible out of the situation.
Yeah, that's a reasonable way to look at it. It doesn't seem like it'll drastically change the global supply of rare earth elements.
So how are other countries reacting to these peace talks between the U.S. and Russia about Ukraine?
Well, let's just say there's some tension brewing. A few European politicians have voiced concerns that, the U.S. is negotiating without really taking their point of view into account or considering what the consequences could be for Europe. They feel kind of left out, especially when it comes to Ukraine's future and what it'll mean for European security as a whole.
So the U.S. is pursuing what they see as practical solutions, but some European nations are feeling left behind, maybe even a little betrayed by this change in approach.
Exactly. It's like the U.S. is saying, we've put a lot into Ukraine, but we're not going to go to war over it. And at the same time, they're telling Europe, you're welcome to take the lead here, but don't expect us to be right there on the front lines.
It really highlights this key takeaway, right? The U.S. is putting its own interests first, and they're not afraid to make decisions that might upset others, even their old allies.
Absolutely.
So we're seeing a world that's, it's in transition. The U.S. is rethinking its role globally, old alliances are being tested, and new power players are stepping onto the stage. It's all so complex and fascinating, and I'm definitely eager to explore it more.
Well, this raises a big question. What kind of world order will emerge from all this change? And maybe even more importantly, what does it mean for countries like Ukraine that are caught in the middle of it all? There's a lot to unpack here.
Definitely, and we'll dive deeper into those questions next time. But for now, let's take a step back and think about what all this means for the average person.
That's a crucial point, right? Because these global shifts aren't just some abstract game. They have real consequences for people and communities everywhere. Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the headlines and think of it like some big chess game, with world leaders making all the moves. But these geopolitical shifts, they can really affect our daily lives in unexpected ways.
That's a really important point. So how could these global shifts impact people on a more personal level?
Well, for one thing, we might see a shift in economic priorities. As the U.S. turns its attention to the Pacific, there could be changes in trade relationships and where investments go. It could affect job markets and even the availability of certain goods and services.
So it's not just about which countries are teaming up or where military bases are being built. We also have to look at how these shifts are going to affect the economy.
Exactly. And then there's the potential for more instability and conflict. As the U.S. steps back from its global role, other countries might feel like they can push their own agendas, which could lead to, regional tensions, maybe even armed clashes.
It makes you wonder if we're heading into a more uncertain, maybe even dangerous world.
It's definitely a possibility. But, change can also bring opportunities, even if it's disruptive. As the global landscape shifts, we might see new partnerships and alliances forming. Maybe it'll lead to a world where power is more evenly distributed, and we hear a wider range of voices and perspectives shaping global affairs.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's potential for positive change, too.
Right. We need to be cautious, but also adaptable. Navigating a changing world means being flexible and open to new ways of thinking.
One of the big themes that has come up in our conversation is this idea of the U.S. stepping back from its role as the global leader. Do you think this is a permanent shift or just a temporary thing?
That's the million-dollar question a lot of analysts are wrestling with right now. Some people think it's cyclical, like the U.S. pulls back every now and then before reasserting itself on the world stage. But others argue this time it's different, that the U.S. is dealing with internal problems and a changing global landscape that will permanently limit its ability to project power the way it used to.
So we don't really know what's going to happen? It's like watching a movie where we haven't seen the ending yet.
Exactly. We're in uncharted territory here. It's too early to say for sure what the long-term consequences of these shifts will be.
This uncertainty must be unsettling for a lot of countries that have depended on the U.S. for so long. How are they adjusting to this new reality?
We're seeing a mix of responses. Some countries are beefing up their own militaries and looking for new alliances, while others are trying to play it safe by keeping close ties with both the U.S. and other rising powers. It's a very fluid situation, and each country is trying to navigate these changes in a way that serves their interests best.
So with all this uncertainty, what can we as individuals do to prepare for this new world order that seems to be emerging?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed. Pay attention to what's happening in global affairs and think critically about how these events might affect your life and your community. Then be adaptable. The world is changing fast, so we need to be flexible and willing to adjust our plans and expectations. And finally, be engaged. Don't be afraid to speak up, share your perspective, and participate in shaping the future.
So it's not about freaking out or hiding from the world. It's about being aware, being adaptable, and taking an active role in this global evolution.
Exactly. We're all part of this interconnected world, and we all have a role to play in building a future that works for everyone. Now, let's zoom in on how these global shifts are playing out in specific regions around the world. Let's start with Europe. What are your thoughts on how things are unfolding there?
It seems like Europe is in a particularly tough spot, especially with the conflict in Ukraine and all the questions about whether the U.S. will stand by NATO. How are European leaders dealing with these challenges?
Europe is definitely at a crossroads. The conflict in Ukraine has shown just how vulnerable they are to Russian aggression, and the U.S. shifting its focus to the Pacific has raised doubts about whether NATO will really be there for them in the long run. It's a wake-up call for Europe to rethink their defense strategies and how much they rely on the U.S.
What are they doing specifically to address these concerns?
We're seeing a renewed push to increase defense spending and strengthen military cooperation between European nations. There's also a growing sense that the European Union needs to become more independent, especially when it comes to security. It's about taking control of their own defense and charting their own course in a world that's becoming more multipolar.
But isn't there a chance that these efforts could actually divide Europe instead of uniting it? Different countries have different priorities and different levels of willingness to invest in defense.
That's a legitimate concern. There are definitely disagreements among European nations about security priorities and how much to spend on defense. There's also the risk that some countries might try to cut their own deals with Russia, which would weaken European unity and create cracks in the alliance. It's a tough balancing act.
It sounds like European leaders are facing a lot of challenges. They need to strengthen their defenses, assert their independence, and maintain unity all at the same time. And they have to do it while dealing with the uncertainty of the U.S.'s role in the region.
Absolutely. It's a complex and ever-changing situation, and there are no easy solutions. Now, let's shift our attention to another region that's going through significant changes, the Middle East.
With the U.S. scaling back its presence in the Middle East, what are some of the key dynamics at play there?
The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the ongoing conflict in Yemen have created a power vacuum that regional powers like Iran and Turkey are trying to fill. We're seeing a resurgence of old rivalries and conflicts as each nation tries to gain influence and control.
So are we going back to the old patterns of competition and conflict that have always characterized the region?
To some extent, yes, but we're also seeing new alliances and dynamics emerging. For instance, the growing relationship between Israel and some Arab states, driven by their shared concerns about Iran, represents a significant shift in the geopolitical landscape. It reminds us that even in the midst of long-standing conflicts, there's always the potential for new alliances and unexpected partnerships.
It seems like this is a recurring theme across different regions, the U.S. taking a step back and regional powers stepping in to fill the gap.
That's a sharp observation. We're seeing a transition from a world dominated by the U.S. to a world where power is shared among multiple players. It's a more complex and dynamic system with new challenges and new opportunities.
And this multipolar world is probably going to be less predictable and maybe even more unstable than what we're used to.
You're right. It requires more diplomatic finesse and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. Now, let's turn our attention to the Asia-Pacific region, which is becoming increasingly important in terms of global power dynamics.
With China's growing influence, how is the U.S. adjusting its strategy in the Asia-Pacific region? What are some of the key developments we should be watching?
The Asia-Pacific is becoming the main stage for competition between major powers, with the U.S. and China vying for influence and dominance. The U.S. is actively engaging in the region, trying to counter China's growing economic and military strength. We're seeing a buildup of U.S. military forces in the region, as well as efforts to strengthen alliances with key partners like Japan, South Korea, and Australia.
So the Asia-Pacific is becoming the main arena for this global power struggle.
It's definitely a major focal point. The stakes are high, as the outcome of this competition will have a big impact on the global balance of power in the 21st century. It's a dynamic and complex situation that demands careful analysis and strategic thinking.
It's fascinating to see how these global power dynamics are playing out in different regions, each with its own unique set of challenges and opportunities. It reminds us that we live in an interconnected world where what happens in one part of the globe can have significant consequences elsewhere.
That's exactly why it's so important to stay informed and engage with these issues. We're witnessing a fundamental reshaping of the global order, a transition from old ways of thinking to new realities. And as individuals, we have a responsibility to understand these shifts and help shape the future.
It can feel overwhelming trying to make sense of all these complex geopolitical changes. But I think our conversation today has provided valuable insights into the forces at play and the potential implications for the world we live in.
I agree. While these changes can create uncertainty, they also present opportunities for those who are willing to embrace change and adapt to new realities.
It's about recognizing both the challenges and the possibilities that lie ahead, and approaching them with a blend of realism and optimism.
Exactly. The key is to approach these shifts with a combination of realism and optimism, recognizing both the challenges and the possibilities that lie ahead.
It's definitely a lot to take in, but I think you've done a fantastic job of explaining these complicated global shifts in a way that makes sense. Our listeners must have a much clearer picture now of how these changes could affect their lives and the world around them.
I appreciate that. And it's not always about understanding the big picture, right? Sometimes the most interesting insights come from looking at the smaller details, the things that might seem insignificant at first.
I totally agree. It's often those overlooked details that reveal the real story, the human side of these global events.
Like, remember those reports about the U.S. negotiating with Ukraine for access to rare earth elements? On the surface, it might seem like just another economic deal, but it really tells you a lot about the power dynamics at play.
It's like a tiny example of that larger shift we're seeing, with the U.S. trying to secure its interests in a region where its influence is fading.
Exactly. It highlights how even small negotiations can have big consequences and reveal what's really motivating the players involved.
It reminds us that we need to pay attention to the subtle signals, the things that aren't always in the headlines, to really understand this new world order.
Absolutely. It's like being a detective, putting the pieces together. And sometimes those pieces come from most unexpected places.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, what's the most important piece of advice you would give our listeners as they try to make sense of this changing world?
Stay curious. Keep asking questions and never stop learning. The world is constantly changing, and the more informed and engaged we are, the better we'll be able to adapt and thrive in this new era.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a truly enlightening conversation.
It was my pleasure. Always a pleasure to discuss these topics with someone as enthusiastic and insightful as you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the changing landscape of global power. We hope you've gained valuable knowledge and a new perspective on the world around you.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day,